The first time Augusta Donnelly heard her father's name spoken in a crowded saloon, she watched three grown men reach for their pistols before anyone had said a word about trouble. And that was the moment she understood the weight she carried simply by sharing his blood. The year was 1881, and the town of Prosperity Creek sat in the Wyoming Territory like a scab that refused to heal. A cluster of clapboard buildings and dust-choked streets pressed between red rock hills, and a river too stubborn to run dry. Augusta had come there 3 months earlier with nothing but a mule, a rifle her father had taught her to shoot before he ever taught her to read properly, and a name she had already decided to bury. Her father was Silas Donnelly, once the most feared outlaw between the Missouri line and the Rocky Mountains, a man whose exploits had been printed in dime novels sold for a nickel in every railway depot from Cheyenne to Denver. He had robbed banks and stage coaches for the better part of 2 decades, and though he had never killed a man in cold blood, as he was fond of saying with a strange sort of pride, he had left plenty of them bleeding and humiliated in the dirt. Augusta had grown up in his shadow, moving from hideout to hideout, learning to break camp before dawn and to read the fear in a stranger's eyes before he even knew he was afraid. She had loved her father in the desperate, complicated way a daughter loves a man who is both her whole world and the reason decent folk cross the street to avoid her. When he had finally been shot in a failed robbery attempt near the Nebraska border 2 years prior, dying slow in a boarding house bed with the marshal's men waiting outside for him to either die or be dragged out in chains, Augusta had sat beside him and listened to his last confession. He had wept, which she had never seen him do before, not even when her mother had died of fever when Augusta was only 9 years old. He had told her that he was sorry for the life he had given her, sorry that the name Donnelly would follow her like a curse into whatever life she tried to build. He had begged her forgiveness and she had given it freely, because despite everything, he was still her father, and she understood that the world had made him hard long before he had made himself an outlaw. But forgiveness for him did not mean forgiveness for herself, and in the 2 years since his death, Augusta had wandered through half a dozen territories trying to outrun the weight of a name that opened doors only to slam them shut once people learned whose daughter she truly was. She had worked as a seamstress in Abilene until a former associate of her father's had recognized her and spread the word, costing her the position within a week. She had tried teaching school in a small town in Colorado until the parents, upon learning her lineage, had petitioned to have her removed, fearful she might corrupt their children with outlaw blood. So when she arrived in Prosperity Creek with dust on her boots and desperation gnawing at her belly, she had done something she had never done before. She had lied about her name. She called herself Augusta Reyes, taking her mother's maiden name, and she had found work at the town's only boarding house, cleaning rooms and cooking meals for the handful of travelers who passed through on their way to somewhere better. It was honest work, humble work, and for the first time in her 22 years, she felt something like peace settling into her bones, even if it was built on a foundation of deception. It was on a Tuesday in early April, with the cottonwoods along the creek just beginning to bud green, that Elijah Norris first walked into her life. He came into the boarding house dining room looking like a man who had ridden hard and long, his duster coat gray with trail dust, his dark hair pressed flat beneath a hat that had seen better years. He was perhaps 28 years old, tall and lean in the way of men who worked cattle for a living, with a face that might have been handsome if it were not so tired, and eyes the color of good whiskey that seemed to take in everything without judgment. He asked for a room and a meal, and Augusta, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron, told him supper would be ready within the hour and showed him to the small room at the end of the hall. "Much obliged," he said, and there was something careful in the way he spoke, as though words were coins he did not wish to spend carelessly. She thought nothing more of him until supper, when he sat alone at the corner table and she brought him a plate of beans and salt pork and fresh bread she had baked that morning. He thanked her again, and when she turned to leave, he spoke. "You are new to this town," he said. It was not quite a question. 3 months, she answered, surprised he had noticed. Most travelers barely looked at the woman who served their food. "I come through here every few months, driving cattle up from Texas to the railhead at Cheyenne," he said. "Never seen you before this year." "I came from Colorado," she said, which was true enough, though it left out the 6 other places she had come from before that. He nodded, seeming to accept this as sufficient, and returned to his meal, and Augusta found herself lingering a moment longer than necessary before she went back to the kitchen. Over the following days, she learned more about him through the idle talk of the boarding house's other guests and the shopkeepers along the main street. Elijah Norris was known as a fair man, a foreman for one of the larger cattle outfits that ran herds up from the Texas Panhandle. He was respected among the drovers for his steady hand and his refusal to cheat a man out of his wages, and there was talk that he had once been offered a partnership in the outfit itself, but had turned it down, preferring the open trail to the responsibilities of ownership. He stayed in Prosperity Creek for 4 days that first visit, resting his horses before continuing north, and in that time, Augusta found herself drawn to him in a way she had not expected and did not entirely welcome. There was a stillness to him, a patience that reminded her of the mountains themselves, unshaken by the small storms of the world around them. On the 3rd evening, she found him sitting on the boarding house porch after supper, watching the sun sink behind the western hills, and she brought him a cup of coffee without being asked. "You did not have to do that," he said, taking the cup with a small nod of thanks. "I know," she replied, settling into the chair beside him, more forward than she usually allowed herself to be with strangers. "I wanted to." He glanced at her sideways, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Well then, I am grateful for the wanting." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the light change over the hills, and then he asked her, quite simply, "What is it that brought you all the way out here, Miss Reyes? A young woman alone, working in a boarding house at the edge of nowhere. Seems like there ought to be a story in that." Augusta felt her chest tighten, the old familiar fear rising up. "There are stories in everyone," she said carefully. "Mine is not so different from most." "I doubt that," he said, not unkindly, "but I will not press you on it. A person's past is their own business until they decide to share it." That simple statement, so unlike the prying curiosity she usually encountered, struck something deep in Augusta's chest. She looked at him properly then, taking in the lines around his eyes that spoke of long days beneath a punishing sun, the calluses on his hands that told of years of hard labor, and she thought that perhaps this was a man who understood something about carrying burdens of his own. "Do you have people, Mr. Norris?" she asked. "Family somewhere waiting for you?" His expression shifted, something passing across his face like a cloud crossing the sun. "I had a brother," he said, "younger than me by 3 years. He is gone now, 3 winters past. Fever took him before I could get a doctor out to where we were working." "I am sorry," Augusta said softly. "As am I," he replied. "But grief teaches a man things if he lets it. Taught me that time is not something to be wasted on foolishness or bitterness. A person ought to live as true as they can for as long as they are given." Augusta thought of her father then, of all the years spent running, of the lies she had told and the name she had buried, and she wondered if she was truly living as true as she could, or simply hiding from a truth too heavy to carry into the light. When Elijah left Prosperity Creek 4 days later, driving his small herd north toward the railhead, Augusta found herself standing on the boarding house porch longer than necessary, watching the dust cloud rise behind his horse until it disappeared over the horizon. She told herself it did not matter, that he was simply a traveler passing through, one of hundreds who came and went from towns like this one without ever leaving a permanent mark. But something in her chest ached with a hollowness she recognized, though she had not felt it in a very long time, and she suspected, with no small amount of dread, that she had allowed herself to hope for something she had long ago decided was not meant for a woman like her. 2 months passed before Elijah Norris returned to Prosperity Creek, and in that time, Augusta's careful new life began to show its first cracks. It started with a letter, delivered by the weekly stage from Cheyenne, addressed simply to the Donnelly girl, Prosperity Creek, Wyoming Territory. The station master, a curious man named Otis Beckwith who fancied himself the eyes and ears of the entire town, had made the mistake of asking around before delivering it, wondering aloud to half a dozen townsfolk whether anyone knew of a Donnelly girl living among them. By the time the letter reached Augusta's hands, the whispers had already begun. The letter itself was from a lawyer in Cheyenne, informing her that her father's small estate, such as it was, a plot of land he had purchased under an assumed name years before his death, had finally cleared probate and now belonged to her. It was not a fortune, merely 40 acres of scrubland with a modest cabin, but it was more than Augusta had ever expected to inherit from a man who had spent his life stealing rather than saving. She should have been grateful. Instead, she felt only dread, because the letter had exposed her secret to the very people she had worked so hard to convince of her respectability. Mrs. Abernathy, who ran the boarding house and had come to rely on Augusta's steady work and gentle nature, confronted her within the hour, the letter held between two fingers as though it were something diseased. "Is this true?" the older woman demanded. "You are Silas Donnelly's daughter, the outlaw." Augusta could not bring herself to lie again, not when the truth had already found its way into the light. "Yes," she said quietly, "I am his daughter, but I have never broken a law in my life, Mrs. Abernathy. I came here to build something honest away from that name." "Honest," Mrs. Abernathy repeated, as though tasting the word and finding it bitter. "You lied to me about your very name, girl. What else have you lied about?" "Nothing," Augusta said, though her voice trembled. "I only wanted a chance to be judged for who I am, not who my father was." But Mrs. Abernathy would not be moved, and by the following morning, Augusta found her few belongings packed and waiting on the boarding house porch, along with 2 weeks' wages she had not yet earned, offered more out of guilt than generosity. Word spread through Prosperity Creek like fire through dry summer grass. The shopkeepers who had once greeted her warmly now regarded her with suspicion. Children who had once waved to her from their yards were called inside by wary mothers. Within a week, Augusta found herself as much an outcast in this small Wyoming town as she had been in every other place she had tried to call home. She might have left then, packed her mule and moved on to some other town where the name Donnelly had not yet followed her, but something stubborn had taken root in her heart, some refusal to keep running from a truth she had not chosen and could not change. Instead, she used what little money she had to travel to the small plot of land her father had left her, a modest parcel some 5 miles outside of Prosperity Creek proper, bordered by a seasonal creek and a stand of cottonwood trees that offered welcome shade. The cabin was rough but sound, built of logs that had weathered well despite years of neglect, and Augusta set about making it habitable with the same stubborn determination that had carried her across half a dozen territories. She patched the roof, cleared the small garden plot that had gone to weeds, and began, slowly, to build something that was entirely her own. It was during this time, some 6 weeks after her exile from the boarding house, that Elijah Norris returned to Prosperity Creek, driving another herd north toward the railhead, and found the town buzzing with talk of the outlaw's daughter who had been living among them under a false name. He listened to the gossip with growing unease, recognizing immediately that they spoke of the same Augusta Rays who had served him supper and coffee on a porch 2 months before, the same woman whose quiet strength and careful kindness had lingered in his thoughts throughout his long journey north and back again. He asked around discreetly until he learned where she had gone, and on his second evening in town, rather than resting his tired body at the boarding house, He saddled his horse and rode the 5 miles out to the small cabin by the creek. Augusta was mending a torn shirt on the cabin's small porch when she heard the approach of a horse, and her hand instinctively moved toward the rifle she kept leaned against the doorframe, a habit born of years spent never quite trusting the safety of any place she called home. But when she saw who it was, riding up through the gathering dusk with his hat pushed back from his face, she felt her breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "Mr. Norris," she said, setting down her mending as he dismounted. "I did not expect to see you again. I heard about what happened in town," he said, his voice careful but not unkind. "About your name." Augusta felt her cheeks flush with something between shame and defiance. "Then I suppose you have come to tell me you cannot associate with an outlaw's daughter either." "No," he said simply, stepping closer, his eyes steady on hers. "I have come because I wanted to hear the truth from your own lips, not from the mouths of townsfolk who never troubled themselves to know you." Augusta studied his face for a long moment, searching for the judgment she had come to expect from everyone who learned her father's name, but found instead only a quiet patience, the same stillness that had drawn her to him months before. "Sit," she said finally, gesturing to the second chair on the small porch. "I will tell you everything, and then you may decide for yourself what to make of me." And so she did. She told him of her childhood spent moving from hideout to hideout, of learning to read tracks and signs before she ever learned her letters properly, of the strange mixture of love and shame she carried for a father who had taught her to shoot a rifle with steady hands but had also taught her, through hard necessity, how to lie convincingly when the law came asking questions. She told him of her mother's death when she was young, of the years that followed with only her father for company and guidance, of his eventual capture and the slow, painful death that had followed, and of the promise she had made to herself in the aftermath, to build a life entirely her own, free from the weight of the Donnelly name. Elijah listened without interruption, his expression unreadable in the fading light, and when she finished, the silence between them stretched long enough that Augusta began to fear she had misjudged him after all, that he would rise and ride away without another word, another decent person lost to the shadow of her father's sins. But instead he said quietly, "My own father was no saint either, Miss Donnelly." The name, spoken so plainly and without malice, struck her like a physical blow. It was the first time in months anyone had called her by her true name without accusation in their voice. "He drank," Elijah continued, "something fierce, and when he drank, he had a temper that left marks on my mother and on my brother and me more times than I care to remember. I left home at 15 years old and never looked back, and for years I carried a shame about it, as though his failures were somehow my own, as though the blood in my veins made me destined for the same cruelty." "What changed your mind?" Augusta asked softly. "Time," he said. "Hard work. Learning that a man or a woman is not simply the sum of the sins committed by those who came before them. You did not rob any banks, Miss Donnelly. You did not hold up any stage coaches or terrorize any decent folk. You have done nothing but try to survive and build something honest for yourself, and if the town cannot see the difference between you and your father, then the failing lies with them, not with you." Augusta felt tears rising, unexpected and unwelcome, and she brushed them away with the back of her hand, embarrassed by the sudden rush of emotion. "You are the first person to say such a thing to me in longer than I can remember," she admitted. "Then the folks in your life have been fools," Elijah said simply, "and I do not count myself among their number." They talked well into the evening that night, the conversation flowing easier than Augusta would have believed possible given the weight of the truths she had just confessed. Elijah spoke of his years driving cattle, of the freedom he found in the open trail, and the responsibility he felt toward the men who worked under him, drovers who depended on fair wages and honest treatment in a business that often offered neither. Augusta spoke of her hopes for the small plot of land she had inherited, of wanting to raise chickens and perhaps a small herd of goats, of the strange comfort she found in tending a garden that was entirely her own, planted by her own hands rather than seized through theft or deception. When he finally rose to return to town, the stars had come out in full, scattered like spilled salt across the black Wyoming sky, and Elijah paused at the bottom of the porch steps, looking back at her with an expression she could not quite read in the darkness. "I will be passing through again in another 2 months," he said, "driving another herd north. Would it trouble you if I called on you again when I return?" Augusta's heart beat quick and hard against her ribs. "It would not trouble me," she said. "I would welcome it." He smiled then, the first true smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his tired face into something almost boyish in its warmth. "Then I will look forward to it, Miss Donnelly," he said, and mounted his horse and rode back toward town, leaving Augusta standing on her porch beneath the vast Wyoming sky, feeling something she had not allowed herself to feel in longer than she could remember: hope. The weeks that followed were not easy ones for Augusta. Though she had found a measure of peace at her small cabin, the isolation weighed on her, and the memory of her exile from Prosperity Creek proper still stung whenever she made the necessary trips into town for supplies. The general store owner, a thin, nervous man named Frank Whitley, served her with barely concealed reluctance, and more than once she overheard whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she drew near, the speakers' faces flushing with the particular shame of those caught in unkindness. But she persevered. She traded eggs from the small flock of chickens she had acquired for other necessities, mended clothes for the few townsfolk willing to overlook her lineage in exchange for her skilled needlework, and slowly, methodically, built a life that owed nothing to her father's ill-gotten gains and everything to her own 2 hands. It was during this period that she first encountered Sheriff Marcus Doyle, a stern man in his 50s who had held the position of Prosperity Creek's law enforcement for nearly a decade. He rode out to her cabin one afternoon in late June, his expression grim, and Augusta felt her old instincts rising, the familiar fear of lawmen that her father's life had instilled in her from childhood. "Miss Donnelly," he said, dismounting slowly, his hand resting near his holster in a gesture that seemed more habit than threat, "I have had some concerns raised about your presence in this territory." "I have broken no laws, Sheriff," Augusta said, standing firm on her porch, refusing to let the old fear show in her voice. "I own this land legally, inherited through proper probate. I have committed no crime." "That may be so," Doyle said, "but your father's reputation casts a long shadow. There are those in town who fear you might be harboring associates of his, or worse, planning to follow in his footsteps." Augusta felt anger flare hot in her chest, cutting through the fear. "I have spent my entire adult life trying to escape my father's footsteps, Sheriff. I have never robbed a soul, never held a gun to anyone who did not deserve to have one held to them in self-defense, and I resent the implication that simply sharing his blood makes me a criminal." Doyle studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened, just slightly. "I do not say I believe you guilty of anything, Miss Donnelly. But I have a duty to investigate concerns raised by the citizens of this town, and I would be remiss in that duty if I did not at least speak with you directly." "Then speak," Augusta said. "Ask me whatever you wish." He asked her a series of questions about her activities since arriving in the territory, about any correspondence she might have received from associates of her father, about her intentions regarding the small plot of land she now owned. Augusta answered each question honestly and directly, and by the time the interview concluded, Doyle seemed satisfied, if not entirely warm in his assessment of her. "I will inform the concerned parties that I have found no evidence of wrongdoing," he said, mounting his horse once more. "But I would advise you, Miss Donnelly, to keep your affairs entirely above reproach. This town has long memories, and your father's reputation will not fade easily, whether that seems fair to you or not." "It does not seem fair," Augusta said quietly, "but I have learned that fairness is not something the world owes to anyone, least of all to those born into circumstances they did not choose. After Doyle left, Augusta sat on her porch for a long while, watching the afternoon light shift across the hills, and thought about the precarious nature of the life she was trying to build. Even with no crime to her name, even with honest work and honest intentions, she remained vulnerable to the suspicions and judgments of a community that could not or would not separate her from her father's sins. She thought of Elijah then, and wondered whether his kindness during their last conversation had been a momentary impulse, easily forgotten, once he returned to the wider world beyond Prosperity Creek. She told herself not to hope too much, not to build castles from a single evening's conversation, but as the days passed and turned into weeks, she found herself watching the road that led toward town with increasing frequency, waiting for a sign of his return. He came back precisely when he said he would, in the third week of August, driving another herd north toward the Cheyenne railhead. This time, rather than waiting for evening, he rode out to her cabin the very afternoon of his arrival in the territory, his horse still lathered from the trail, his face weathered further by another summer's sun. Augusta was in her garden when she heard his approach, and she rose from among the rows of vegetables she had been tending, wiping dirt from her hands onto her apron, her heart beating with an anticipation she had not felt in longer than she could remember. "You came," she said, unable to keep the note of relief from her voice. "I told you I would," Elijah replied, dismounting and approaching the garden fence. "Did you doubt me?" "I have learned not to place too much faith in promises," Augusta admitted, "even well-intentioned ones." "Well," he said, "I intend to prove myself an exception to whatever poor experiences have taught you that lesson." They spent the afternoon together, Augusta showing him the progress she had made on the cabin and garden, Elijah sharing stories of the long drive north, the challenges of managing a herd of nearly 2,000 head of cattle across difficult terrain, the men who worked under his direction, and the small triumphs and frustrations of their shared labor. As the sun began to set, painting the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples, they sat together on the porch steps, closer than propriety might have strictly allowed, and talked as though they had known each other for years rather than months. "I have been thinking about you," Elijah admitted, as darkness began to settle around them. "More than I probably ought to admit, given how briefly we have known each other." Augusta felt her pulse quicken. "I have been thinking of you as well," she confessed, "though I have tried to convince myself it was foolish to do so." "Why foolish?" he asked, turning to look at her directly, his whiskey-colored eyes catching the last light of the setting sun. "Because I am the daughter of an outlaw," she said, "and you are a respected foreman, a man with a good name and honest prospects. What future could there possibly be for a man like you with a woman like me?" Elijah reached out then, gently taking her hand in his calloused fingers warm against her own. "Augusta," he said, using her given name for the first time, and the sound of it in his voice sent a shiver through her entire body. "I do not care what name your father gave you, or what sins he committed before you were even old enough to understand right from wrong. I care about the woman sitting beside me now, the woman who has built something honest out of nothing, who has faced the judgment of an entire town with more grace and courage than most people could manage. That is the woman I have been thinking about, and that is the woman I would very much like to court, if you will allow it." Augusta felt tears rising again, though this time they were tears of joy rather than shame. "I would allow it," she said softly, "more than allow it. I would welcome it." He leaned toward her then slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished, and when their lips finally met, it was gentle and tentative at first, then deepening into something more certain as Augusta's hand rose to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Elijah smiled at her with an expression of such open tenderness that Augusta felt something long frozen within her begin, at last, to thaw. "I have 3 more months of driving ahead of me before the season ends," he said. After that, I intend to settle for the winter, perhaps take up a smaller piece of work closer to town. If you would permit it, I would like to spend that time getting to know you properly, courting you as a woman like yourself deserves to be courted." "I would like that very much," Augusta said, and meant it with her entire heart. Over the following months, Elijah made good on his promise. Whenever his cattle driving duties brought him near Prosperity Creek, he would find time to visit Augusta's small cabin, bringing small gifts, a length of ribbon purchased in Cheyenne, a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy, a jar of honey from a trading post along his route. They spent afternoons walking along the creek that bordered her property, evenings sitting on her porch discussing everything from their childhood memories to their hopes for the future. And slowly, carefully, they began to fall in love in the way that mature adults fall in love, with full knowledge of each other's flaws and past struggles, choosing to embrace rather than despite them. But their growing happiness was not without its complications. Prosperity Creek remained wary of Augusta, and word of Elijah's courtship spread quickly through the small community, drawing criticism from those who felt he was risking his good reputation by associating with the outlaw's daughter. The most vocal of these critics was a woman named Prudence Halloway, the wife of the town's banker, who had appointed herself something of a moral guardian for the community. She confronted Elijah directly one afternoon in early October, as he was purchasing supplies at the general store before riding out to visit Augusta. "Mr. Norris," she said, her voice carrying the particular sharpness of someone convinced of their own righteousness, "I feel it my duty to warn you against continuing your association with Miss Donnelly. Her father was a notorious criminal, and blood tells, Mr. Norris. It always tells eventually." Elijah turned to face her, his expression carefully controlled despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Mrs. Halloway," he said, "I have come to know Augusta Donnelly quite well over these past months, and I have found her to be a woman of remarkable integrity and strength. I would ask that you refrain from judging her based on sins that were never her own to commit." "But surely you must worry," Prudence pressed, "about what kind of children such a union might produce. What if her father's tendencies were to manifest in the next generation?" The suggestion, so casually cruel, made Elijah's jaw tighten with barely contained fury. "Mrs. Halloway," he said, his voice low and dangerous in a way that made several other customers in the store pause their business to listen. "Character is not passed down like eye color or the shape of one's nose. It is built through choices, through the way a person chooses to live their life despite whatever circumstances they were born into. Augusta Donnelly has chosen, every single day since her father's death, to live honestly and with integrity, and I would trust her character, and any children we might one day be blessed with, far more than I would trust the character of those who spend their days spreading unfounded cruelty about a woman who has never done them harm." He paid for his supplies and left the store without another word, leaving Prudence Halloway flushed with embarrassment, and several other townsfolk exchanging glances that suggested his defense of Augusta had not gone unnoticed or entirely unappreciated. When he related the incident to Augusta later that same day, she felt a fierce swell of gratitude and love for this man who had chosen, without hesitation, to defend her honor against the casual cruelty of small minds. "You did not need to say all that," she said, though her voice was thick with emotion. "I said only what I believe to be true," Elijah replied simply. "And I will continue saying it to anyone who questions the worth of the woman I intend to marry should she agree to have me." Augusta's breath caught at the implication in his words. "Are you asking me to marry you, Elijah Norris?" He knelt then, right there on her porch steps, taking both her hands in his. "Not yet," he said, smiling up at her. "I intend to ask you properly when I have something worthy to offer you. But I wanted you to know my intentions, so that you might consider them as we continue to build whatever this is between us. I have never needed grand gestures or worthy offerings," Augusta said, kneeling down to meet him at eye level. I need only honesty and kindness, and you have given me both in abundance. Then perhaps, he said, I should ask you properly right now, rather than waiting for some more suitable moment that may never come. Perhaps you should, Augusta agreed, her heart pounding with anticipation. But before he could speak the words that hung between them, a sudden commotion from the direction of the road interrupted the moment. The sound of horses approaching at speed, and both Augusta and Elijah rose quickly, old instincts of caution overriding romantic sentiment. 3 riders came into view, moving fast along the road that led to Augusta's cabin, and as they drew closer, Augusta felt her blood run cold with recognition. She knew these men, or rather, she knew their type, the particular swagger and dress of men who lived outside the law, men not unlike those who had once ridden alongside her father in his younger days. "Get inside," Elijah said quietly, positioning himself between Augusta and the approaching riders. "No," Augusta said, retrieving her rifle from beside the door instead. "If trouble has come, I will not hide from it." The 3 riders reined in their horses at the edge of the property, and their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, called out with false friendliness. "We are looking for Silas Donnelly's daughter. Word has it she inherited some property out this way." "You have found her," Augusta called back, rifle raised and steady in her hands. "What business do you have with me?" The scarred man smiled, an expression that held no warmth whatsoever. "Your father owed some debts before he died, Miss Donnelly. Debts to certain associates of his. We have come to collect on those debts, seeing as how you have inherited what was rightfully his." "My father's debts died with him," Augusta said firmly. "I owe nothing to anyone, least of all to men who ride onto private property making threats." "We are not making threats," the man replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Merely stating facts. Your father borrowed a considerable sum from associates of mine some years back, intended for a job that never quite came to fruition. That debt remains outstanding, and we have come to see it settled." Elijah stepped forward slightly, his own hand resting near the pistol at his hip, though he made no move to draw it. "The lady has told you she owes nothing," he said. "I would suggest you turn your horses around and return to wherever you came from." The scarred man's eyes flicked to Elijah with sudden interest. "And who might you be? Some hired protection for the outlaw's daughter?" "I am the man who intends to marry her," Elijah said, his voice steady and clear. "And I would advise you against causing trouble on land that belongs to her, unless you wish to explain yourselves to Sheriff Doyle in town." This seemed to give the 3 riders pause, and they exchanged glances among themselves, clearly weighing their options. After a moment, the scarred man spoke again, his tone shifting slightly. "We have no wish for trouble with the law. But this debt remains, and we will return to discuss it further when perhaps circumstances are more favorable to reasonable conversation." With that veiled threat hanging in the air, the 3 riders turned their horses and departed, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Augusta lowered her rifle slowly, her hands trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. "They will return," she said quietly. "Men like that do not simply disappear because they were told no." "Then we will be ready for them," Elijah said, moving to stand beside her, his arm coming around her shoulders in a gesture of protection and comfort. "You are not alone in this, Augusta. Whatever comes, we will face it together." That night, unable to leave her alone given the threat that now hung over her small property, Elijah remained at the cabin, sleeping in the small barn rather than risk any impropriety, but close enough to respond should the riders return under cover of darkness. Augusta found herself grateful for his presence, though sleep came only in fitful bursts as she turned over the scarred man's words in her mind, trying to remember if her father had ever mentioned associates who might harbor such grievances. She recalled, slowly and with growing dread, a conversation from years before, when her father had spoken of a job that had gone wrong in Nebraska, money borrowed from a man named Cutter to fund an ambitious robbery that had ultimately failed to materialize due to unexpected complications. Her father had spoken of Cutter with genuine fear, describing him as a man who never forgot a debt and never forgave those who failed to repay him. The following morning, she shared this memory with Elijah, and his expression grew grave as he listened. "If this Cutter is indeed behind yesterday's visit," he said, "then we face a more serious threat than simple opportunistic thieves. Men like that do not give up easily, and they rarely negotiate in good faith." "What do you suggest we do?" Augusta asked, fear creeping into her voice despite her efforts to remain calm. "We inform Sheriff Doyle," Elijah said. "Whatever his personal feelings about your father's reputation, he is sworn to protect the citizens of this territory, and extortion by outside criminals falls well within his jurisdiction to address." They rode into town together that morning, and despite the awkwardness of their reception given the ongoing gossip about their relationship, Sheriff Doyle listened carefully to their account of the previous day's confrontation. "Cutter," he said when Augusta mentioned the name, his expression darkening. "I have heard of him. A dangerous man wanted in 3 territories for various crimes, though he has managed to evade capture through a combination of cunning and ruthlessness. If he has indeed set his sights on you, Miss Donnelly, we would do well to take the threat seriously." "What can be done?" Elijah asked. "We cannot simply wait for them to return and hope for the best." Doyle considered the question for a long moment. "I will send word to the territorial marshal, request additional support given the seriousness of the threat. In the meantime, I would suggest Miss Donnelly consider staying somewhere less isolated, at least until we better understand Cutter's intentions." "I will not abandon my property," Augusta said firmly. "I have worked too hard to build something of my own to flee at the first sign of trouble." "Then perhaps," Elijah suggested, "we might arrange for additional protection at the cabin itself, rather than requiring Augusta to abandon what she has built." Doyle nodded slowly. "That seems a more reasonable compromise. I can spare a deputy for occasional patrols, though I cannot guarantee constant protection given my other duties in town." The arrangement, while imperfect, offered some measure of security, and over the following days, Augusta and Elijah settled into a watchful routine, always alert for any sign of Cutter's return, though the days passed without further incident, leading to a cautious hope that perhaps the threat had been merely bluster rather than genuine intent. This hope proved premature. Nearly 2 weeks after the initial confrontation, on a moonless night in early November, Augusta woke to the sound of her chickens squawking in alarm, followed by the unmistakable crackle of flames. She rushed to her window to find her small barn ablaze, orange light flickering against the darkness, and her heart seized with terror as she realized Elijah had been sleeping in that very barn, maintaining his watchful vigil. She burst from the cabin, rifle in hand, screaming Elijah's name into the smoke-filled night, and relief flooded through her when she saw his figure emerging from the barn's side entrance, coughing but apparently unharmed, dragging his saddle and gear to safety. "Cutter's men," he gasped once he had reached her side. "I saw them fleeing on horseback just before the fire caught. This was no accident." Together they worked frantically to save what they could from the burning barn, though the structure itself proved impossible to salvage, and by the time dawn broke over the Wyoming hills, only smoldering ruins remained where the barn had once stood. "This cannot continue," Elijah said, surveying the damage with grim determination. "Cutter has shown he is willing to escalate his threats into genuine violence. We need more than occasional patrols from an overworked deputy. We need a permanent solution." They rode into town immediately to report the fire to Sheriff Doyle, who listened with growing concern as they described the attack. "This changes matters considerably," Doyle said. "Arson and threatened violence move well beyond mere intimidation. I will send word to the territorial marshal immediately, request whatever assistance can be mustered. In the meantime, I would strongly advise, Miss Donnelly, that you and Mr. Norris consider relocating to town proper, at least temporarily, until this matter can be properly addressed." This time, Augusta did not argue against the suggestion, recognizing the genuine danger they now faced. She and Elijah relocated to a small rented room above the general store, arrangements made possible by Frank Whitley's grudging willingness to rent to them given the extraordinary circumstances. And together, they waited for the marshal's response, while Doyle organized what limited resources he could muster to track down Cutter and his associates. The waiting proved its own form of torture, each day bringing fresh anxiety about when and how Cutter might strike again. But it also brought Augusta and Elijah closer together than ever before, their shared danger forging a bond that might have taken years to develop under more ordinary circumstances. It was during this tense period, some 4 days after the barn fire, that Elijah finally spoke the words he had been holding since that interrupted moment on Augusta's porch steps. They were sitting together in their small rented room, sharing a simple supper of bread and cheese purchased from the store below, when Elijah set down his food and took Augusta's hands in his. "I do not wish to wait any longer for some perfect moment that may never arrive," he said, his voice earnest and slightly unsteady with emotion. "Augusta Donnelly, I love you with my whole heart. I have loved you since that first evening on your porch, watching the sunset while you brought me coffee I had not even asked for. I love your strength and your honesty, your refusal to let the world's judgment break your spirit, your gentleness with living things, and your fierce protection of what you hold dear. I do not know what dangers we may yet face from Cutter and his associates, but whatever comes, I want to face it as your husband if you will have me. Will you marry me, Augusta?" Tears streamed freely down Augusta's face as she nodded, unable to speak for a moment through the overwhelming rush of emotion. "Yes," she finally managed. "Yes, Elijah Norris, I will marry you. I love you too, more than I ever believed myself capable of loving anyone." He kissed her then, deeply, and with the full weight of everything they had endured and hoped for still ahead of them, and for a brief moment, the danger that surrounded them seemed to fade into insignificance beside the profound joy of their mutual declaration. But the danger remained very real, and it would not be long before it demanded their attention once more. 3 days after Elijah's proposal, word arrived that a territorial marshal named Wade Calloway had been dispatched to assist with the Cutter situation, expected to arrive in Prosperity Creek within the week. In the meantime, Sheriff Doyle continued his own investigation, gathering what information he could about Cutter's whereabouts and associates in the region. It was during this investigation that an unexpected piece of the puzzle emerged, one that would ultimately prove crucial to resolving the threat against Augusta once and for all. Doyle discovered that one of the 3 men who had originally confronted Augusta at her cabin, a younger rider who had remained mostly silent during the exchange, was in fact a local man named Jesse Kirkwood, the son of a rancher who lived some 10 miles outside Prosperity Creek. Jesse had apparently fallen into debt through gambling losses and had been recruited by Cutter's gang as a local guide, familiar with the territory and able to provide information about potential targets, including Augusta's inherited property. Doyle paid a visit to the Kirkwood ranch, and after some initial resistance, Jesse's father, mortified to learn of his son's involvement with known criminals, convinced the young man to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for leniency regarding his own culpability. Jesse revealed that Cutter's gang, numbering perhaps 8 men in total, was currently camped in a remote canyon some 15 miles north of Prosperity Creek, using the location as a base while they planned their next move against Augusta. He also revealed, crucially, that Cutter intended to strike again within the week, this time with lethal intent, having grown frustrated with what he perceived as insufficient progress in collecting on the supposed debt. This information, combined with the impending arrival of Marshal Calloway, gave Sheriff Doyle the confidence to organize a more direct response to the threat, rather than simply waiting for Cutter to strike again. When Marshal Calloway arrived in Prosperity Creek 2 days later, A weathered man in his 40s with the calm authority of someone who had faced down countless dangerous men in his career. He immediately began organizing a coordinated response based on Jesse Kirkwood's information about the gang's location. "We cannot simply wait for them to attack again," Calloway said, meeting with Doyle, Elijah, and several deputized townsmen in the sheriff's office. "Better to take the fight to them, on our terms rather than theirs, and end this threat once and for all." Elijah insisted on joining the party that would ride against Cutter's gang, despite Augusta's fervent objections when she learned of the plan. "I cannot simply hide in town while you risk your life," she argued when he informed her of his decision. "If something happens to you, Elijah, I do not know how I would bear it. And if I remain behind while others risk their lives to end this threat against you," he countered gently, "how could I ever call myself worthy of your love? This danger exists because of threats made against you, Augusta. I will not stand aside while others take that risk on my behalf." Augusta understood the logic of his argument, even as her heart rebelled against the danger he intended to face, and in the end, she could only extract a promise that he would be as careful as circumstances allowed, and that he would return to her safely once the threat had been resolved. The confrontation that followed, when Marshal Calloway's party of 8 men, including Elijah and 2 deputized townsmen alongside Doyle and the marshal's own deputies, approached the canyon where Cutter's gang had made their camp, proved less violent than everyone had feared, though not without its moments of genuine danger. Calloway, drawing on years of experience negotiating with outlaws, called out to the camp before any shots were fired, identifying himself as a territorial marshal and offering Cutter and his men the opportunity to surrender peacefully rather than face the consequences of continued criminal activity. Cutter, perhaps recognizing that his gang was outnumbered and outmaneuvered, chose the path of least resistance, emerging from the camp with his hands raised, followed reluctantly by his remaining 6 associates. The confrontation ended without a single shot fired, much to everyone's relief, and Cutter and his gang were taken into custody to face charges for arson, attempted extortion, and various other crimes committed across multiple territories. When Elijah returned to Prosperity Creek that evening, weary but unharmed, Augusta ran to meet him as he dismounted, throwing her arms around him with such force that he nearly stumbled backward, laughing despite his exhaustion. "You are safe," she said, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Thank God you are safe." "I told you I would return to you," he said, holding her close. "The threat is over, Augusta. Cutter and his men are in custody, facing charges that will keep them locked away for a very long time. We are free now, truly free, to build the life we have been dreaming of together." The weeks that followed brought a sense of relief and renewal to Augusta's life that she had scarcely dared to hope for. With Cutter's threat eliminated and word spreading through Prosperity Creek of Elijah's bravery in helping to resolve the dangerous situation, the town's attitude toward Augusta began to shift in subtle but meaningful ways. Mrs. Abernathy, the boarding house proprietor who had once dismissed Augusta from her employment, approached her with an awkward apology some 2 weeks after Cutter's capture, acknowledging that she had perhaps judged too harshly and too quickly, without giving Augusta proper opportunity to demonstrate her true character. "I was frightened," Mrs. Abernathy admitted, "frightened of what associating with an outlaw's daughter might mean for my business and reputation. But I have come to understand that fear made me unkind, and unkindness is not something I wish to carry with me. I hope you might forgive an old woman's foolishness." Augusta, never one to hold grudges when genuine remorse was offered, accepted the apology graciously, and though she did not return to work at the boarding house, having built a satisfying independence through her own small property, she found herself grateful for the gradual thawing of the community's attitude toward her. Even Prudence Holloway, though never quite warm toward Augusta, ceased her public criticisms following the resolution of the Cutter situation, perhaps recognizing that continued hostility toward a woman who had helped bring dangerous criminals to justice would reflect poorly on her own standing in the community. Sheriff Doyle, too, seemed to reassess his earlier suspicions, and when he encountered Augusta in town during the following weeks, his greeting carried a respect that had been notably absent during their first tense interaction. "You have proven yourself an asset to this community, Miss Donnelly," he told her, during one such encounter. "Whatever concerns I once harbored about your presence here, I confess they were misplaced. Prosperity Creek is fortunate to count you among its citizens." With the immediate danger resolved and the community's attitude gradually softening, Augusta and Elijah turned their attention to planning their future together. They decided to rebuild the barn that had been destroyed in Cutter's attack, this time larger and more substantial, anticipating the need for space to house Elijah's horses, alongside Augusta's growing flock of chickens and the small herd of goats she had long dreamed of acquiring. The wedding itself took place on a crisp December morning, some 6 weeks after Cutter's capture, in the small church that served Prosperity Creek's modest congregation. Augusta had feared, given the community's earlier hostility, that few would attend, but she was pleasantly surprised to find the small church nearly full, filled with townsfolk who had come to witness the union of a woman who had proven her worth through actions rather than empty words, and a man whose steady character had earned him the respect of the entire community. Augusta wore a simple dress of pale blue fabric, purchased with the last of her savings and altered by her own skilled hands to fit perfectly. Her dark hair arranged simply but elegantly with a few late-season wildflowers tucked among the curls. Elijah stood at the altar in his best suit, borrowed for the occasion from a friend among the cattle drovers, his weathered face transformed by an expression of such open joy that several attendees later remarked they had never seen a groom look quite so thoroughly besotted with his bride. The ceremony itself was simple, conducted by the town's circuit preacher who happened to be passing through at the appropriate time. But the words exchanged between Augusta and Elijah carried a weight and sincerity that moved several attendees to tears, particularly when Elijah, departing from traditional vows, added his own personal declaration. "Augusta Donnelly," he said, taking her hands in his before the assembled witnesses, "I do not simply promise to love and honor you as my wife. I promise to see you always for who you truly are, a woman of remarkable courage and integrity, entirely separate from any name or reputation not of your own making. I promise to stand beside you against whatever challenges this life presents, as you have already proven yourself willing to stand beside me. I love you not despite your past, but alongside the full truth of who you are, and I will spend the rest of my days grateful that fate brought me to that boarding house dining room where I first laid eyes on you." Augusta, her own voice thick with emotion, replied in kind, "Elijah Norris, you have given me something I never believed I would find, a place where I am seen for myself, not for the shadows my father cast across my life. You have defended my honor against those who would judge me unfairly, stood beside me against genuine danger, and loved me with a patience and tenderness I did not know myself deserving of. I promise to love you with the same fierce loyalty, to build with you a home filled with honesty and warmth, and to face whatever future awaits us with gratitude for the present we have been given." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the small church erupted in applause, and even those townsfolk who had once whispered against Augusta's presence found themselves smiling genuinely at the evident happiness of the newly married couple. The reception that followed, held in the town's small community hall, proved a modest but joyful affair, with neighbors contributing dishes for a shared meal and someone producing a fiddle for impromptu dancing that lasted well into the evening. Augusta found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, surrounded by genuine warmth and celebration, no longer an outcast defined by her father's crimes, but a respected member of a community that had finally taken the time to know her for herself. In the months that followed their marriage, Augusta and Elijah settled into a life of quiet contentment on the property that had once belonged to Augusta's father, transformed now into something entirely new through their combined efforts. Elijah reduced his cattle driving duties to focus on establishing a smaller operation of their own, purchasing a modest herd that he managed alongside occasional consulting work for larger outfits during the busy seasons. Augusta expanded her garden and small livestock operation, and word of her skilled needlework spread through the surrounding communities, bringing steady income through commissioned dress alterations and repairs. They rebuilt not just the barn but expanded the cabin itself, adding a second room as their finances allowed, and slowly transformed what had once been a modest inheritance from a criminal father into a genuine home built through honest labor and mutual devotion. Nearly a year after their wedding, in the autumn of 1882, Augusta discovered she was expecting their first child, news that filled both her and Elijah with a joy tinged with the particular anxiety that accompanies such momentous change. Augusta found herself thinking often, during those months of waiting, about her own complicated childhood, and she and Elijah spent long evenings discussing the kind of parents they hoped to become, determined to provide their child with the stability and unconditional love that Augusta's own upbringing had so often lacked. Their son, whom they named William after Elijah's deceased brother, was born on a warm June morning in 1883, delivered with the assistance of a midwife from a neighboring property. His arrival greeted with tears of joy from both his exhausted but radiant mother and his overwhelmed father, who held his newborn son with a tenderness that spoke to the depth of love he had carried for this child even before his birth. "He is perfect," Elijah whispered, gazing down at William's tiny face, so small and vulnerable in his large calloused hands. "He is," Augusta agreed, watching her husband with a heart so full of love she could scarcely contain it. "And he will grow up knowing only love and honesty, Elijah. I promise you that. He will never have to bury his name or hide from his past the way I once did. He will grow up knowing that his mother is the strongest, most remarkable woman in this entire territory," Elijah replied, "and that his father counts himself the most fortunate man alive to have earned her love." 2 years later, their family grew further with the arrival of their daughter, whom they named Sarah after Augusta's own mother, born in the spring of 1885 with the same easy joy that had accompanied William's birth. By this time, Augusta and Elijah's small ranch had grown into a modestly prosperous operation, their honest reputation established firmly enough that few in the surrounding communities remembered, or cared to remember, the shadow of scandal that had once surrounded Augusta's arrival in Prosperity Creek. Augusta had, in those years, made peace with her father's memory in a way she had not thought possible during those difficult early days of trying to outrun his reputation. She kept a small photograph of him, taken years before his death, tucked away in a drawer, not displayed prominently but not hidden away in shame either, an acknowledgement of the complicated truth that he had been both a criminal who had caused genuine harm to others and a father who had loved her in his own flawed way. She told William and Sarah, as they grew old enough to understand, an honest but age-appropriate version of her history, wanting them to understand that a person's worth was measured not by the circumstances of their birth or the sins of their parents, but by the choices they made with the life they were given. "Your grandfather made many mistakes," she told them, during one such conversation when William was perhaps 8 years old and beginning to ask questions about the grandfather he had never known. "He hurt people through his choices, and that is a truth I cannot and will not hide from you. But he also loved me in his own imperfect way and taught me things about survival and resilience that helped shape who I became. The most important thing I want you to understand, my darlings, is that you are not defined by the mistakes of those who came before you. You are defined by the choices you make with your own lives, just as I had to learn to define myself separate from your grandfather's reputation." Elijah, listening to these conversations, felt a swell of pride and love for his wife that seemed to grow deeper with each passing year, watching her transform the pain of her past into wisdom she could pass down to their children, refusing to let bitterness or shame define the family they were building together. By 1890, nearly a decade after Augusta had first arrived in Prosperity Creek carrying nothing but a false name and desperate hope for a better life, the Norris Ranch had become one of the most respected operations in the surrounding territory, known for fair dealing and honest work, much like Elijah's own reputation had suggested from the very beginning of their acquaintance. Their family had grown to include a third child, a younger son named Thomas born in 1887, and the small cabin that had once stood alone and neglected on Augusta's inherited property had transformed into a substantial ranch house, surrounded by the barn Elijah had helped rebuild, extensive garden plots that Augusta tended with the same careful dedication she had shown from the very beginning, and pastures dotted with the cattle and goats that formed the backbone of their modest prosperity. The town of Prosperity Creek itself had grown alongside their family's fortunes, the railroad's continued expansion bringing new settlers and increased commerce to the region, and Augusta found herself, in the fullness of time, elected to serve on the town's newly formed school board, a position that would have seemed impossible during those early days of exile and suspicion, now offered in recognition of her evident wisdom and dedication to the community's welfare. It was during a school board meeting in the autumn of 1891 that Augusta encountered, quite unexpectedly, a reminder of just how far she had traveled from those difficult early days. A new family had recently settled in the territory, and during introductions, the father mentioned with evident nervousness that they had heard rumors about an outlaw's daughter who had once caused some scandal in the community years before. Augusta, now a respected woman of 32 years, secure in her marriage and her standing within the community, met this comment with a calm dignity that would have seemed impossible during those early days of shame and secrecy. "That outlaw's daughter," she said with a small smile, "is myself, sir. Augusta Norris, formerly Donnelly, and I can assure you that whatever scandal you have heard whispered about has long since been resolved through the simple passage of time and honest living. I would be happy to discuss my history with you directly, rather than relying on second-hand rumors that likely bear little resemblance to the actual truth." The man, visibly embarrassed by his own tactlessness, offered a stumbling apology, and Augusta, gracious in her security, accepted it easily, understanding that the incident reflected more on the persistence of small-town gossip than on any genuine threat to her hard-earned standing within the community. That evening, when she related the exchange to Elijah, he laughed warmly at her account. "You handled that with far more grace than I might have managed," he said. "I confess I still feel a flash of anger whenever someone dares question your worth, even after all these years." "It no longer troubles me the way it once did," Augusta admitted, settling beside him on the porch of their now well-established home, watching their 3 children playing in the yard as the autumn evening settled around them. "I have proven, through years of honest living, that I am more than my father's daughter, more than the shadow of his reputation. I earned my own name, Elijah, through everything we have built together, and no amount of idle gossip can take that away from me now." "You earned it long before we ever married," Elijah said softly, taking her hand in his. "You earned it through every honest day of work, every kindness shown despite the cruelty directed toward you, every moment you chose integrity over the easier path of bitterness or resignation. I merely had the great good fortune to witness that earning, and to fall completely in love with the woman doing it." Augusta leaned against her husband's shoulder, watching their children's laughter echo across the yard, thinking of the long journey that had brought her from a frightened young woman running from her father's shadow to this moment of genuine peace and belonging. "I think," she said quietly, That if my father could see me now, he would be proud in whatever complicated way he was capable of pride. Not proud of the Donnelly name, perhaps, but proud that his daughter found a way to build something honest and lasting, despite everything that came before. I believe he would be, Elijah agreed. Though I suspect he would be equally amazed that his daughter managed to tame such a stubborn cattle-driving fool into a devoted husband and father. Augusta laughed, the sound bright and genuine in the evening air. You were never so difficult to tame, Elijah Norris. You simply needed someone patient enough to see past your quiet exterior to the tender heart underneath. And you needed someone patient enough to see past your father's reputation to the remarkable woman underneath, he countered. I would say we found exactly what we each needed, precisely when we needed it most. As the sun set behind the Wyoming hills that evening, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors that had first drawn Augusta's attention on that early evening years before when she had brought Elijah coffee on the boarding house porch, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for the winding path that had led her to this moment of contentment. She thought of all the towns she had fled, all the false names she had worn like uncomfortable garments, all the years spent believing that her father's sins had permanently marked her as unworthy of genuine happiness or belonging. That frightened young woman could never have imagined this future. A devoted husband who had chosen to defend her honor even before fully understanding the depths of his feelings for her. 3 healthy children who would never know the shame and secrecy that had once defined their mother's existence. A respected place within a community that had finally learned to judge her by her own actions rather than her father's crimes. And a name, Norris now rather than Donnelly, that she had earned through years of honest partnership and shared labor rather than inherited through circumstances beyond her control. William, now 8 years old, called out to his parents from across the yard, requesting they come settle a dispute with his younger sister about whose turn it was to feed the chickens, and Augusta rose with a fond smile, extending her hand to Elijah. "Duty calls," she said, "even for former outlaws' daughters who have earned their own respectable name." "Lead the way, Mrs. Norris," Elijah replied, taking her hand and rising to follow her into the yard where their children waited. "Wherever you go, I will gladly follow, now and for all the years still ahead of us." Together, hand in hand, they walked toward their children, toward the life they had built through courage and honesty and unwavering love, leaving behind forever the shadows of a past that no longer had power to define either of them, standing instead in the full light of a future they had earned through their own choices, their own resilience, and the profound love that had grown between them from that first evening on a boarding house porch. Watching the Wyoming sunset paint the sky in colors as vivid and lasting as the happiness they had built together, one honest day at a time, for the rest of their long and contented lives.